Okay, we're going to go ahead and get going. The good news about a panel discussion is it's going to be easy for those who join late to jump right in. Good afternoon. I'm Rana Dubrow. I am the Director of Membership at CURT, and thank you for joining another webinar in the CURT series. Today, we have a panel discussion on the impact of marijuana legalization on the construction industry. Please use the chat box to ask any questions during this hour. Our presentation is being recorded and will be emailed to all registrants after the event concludes. We will also include the full biographies of our participants. Thank you in advance to our panel, who include the following: Greg Sizemore. Our industry is fortunate to have two Greg Sizemores. Today's Greg Sizemore will be moderating the panel discussion. Greg is Associated Builders and Contractors Vice President, HSE and Workforce Development. Also appearing from ABC is Steve Wiltshire, Director of Safety. Steve will be monitoring the chat box to ensure that your questions are answered. Attorney Scott Green, partner with Goldberg Sagala, will provide the legal point of view. Chris Fout, Merck's Associate Director, Construction Safety for the Americas, will be representing owners. Psychologist Dr. Paul Surgener, Innovation Lead with the National Council for Mental Wellbeing, rounds out our panel. And now, Greg Sizemore. Greg?
Now, there we go. Thank you, Rana, and I appreciate you guys. And to Gregory L. Sizemore on the other side of the fence there, it's exciting. We've known each other for many, many years, been confused and pointed at in many conversations, but I like to refer to myself as Greg may be the smart one, but I'm the good looking one. That's all I'm gonna say about that. So you may agree or disagree with that statement. Again, I want to say thank you very much for participating in this panel. And I can assure you for the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to try to unpackage what frankly is becoming a very significant challenge, particularly in the construction space, particularly in the construction user space. And we're going to start our conversation with basically a statement that's centered around, as more states legalize marijuana, it becomes necessary to look at the impact on the construction industry from both the craft professional and the contractor, but more importantly, the owner or user community to the contractor. And so we're going to explore some things over the next 15 minutes, if you will, that are going to look specifically at what is the effect of the use and or addiction influencers of legal or illegal substances in our industry. What are some mitigating factors that we should consider and think about? What are the inconsistencies that we need to be aware of around drug testing and company policies? And how can owners and contractors avoid certain pitfalls that are out there? Again, like Rona said, I'm very excited to have some subject matter experts join me to address those questions and others on this panel. They will provide, as she said, both the owner perspective, a legal perspective, as well as a mental health perspective. So, gentlemen, I'm going to call on you very, very briefly and just hum a few bars about what qualifies you to be on this panel. And you know, we all were selected. We've been very intentional about you guys participating in this. So I'm going to start with Chris Fout. If you just hum a few bars, a little bit besides your title and what your focus is and why this is an important topic for you.
Okay, spacebar wasn't working to take me off of mute. So my name is Chris Fout. As I was introduced, the Associate Director of Construction Safety for the Americas with Merck Pharmaceutical Company. I have 20 years of experience in construction safety. Everything from being an owner's representative, which the position I'm in now, also having been a field safety representative as well for contracting companies. I've also served as the co-chair of Kurt's Construction Safety Committee, and also recently, or previously, 2 years ago, assigned to OSHA's Advisory Committee for Construction Safety and Health Standards. So a little bit of a background there, and with all the changes that are happening right now in regards to legalization of marijuana, it's definitely having an impact on our industry, and one that if we don't take steps now, we could actually be in some serious trouble down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Very insightful. And full disclosure, Chris and I both served on ACOSH together, and we've got quite a kindred spirit between the both of us. So if we get to joking back and forth, there's a reason for that. Paul, I'm going to come to you next. You and I have spoke a lot about this, particularly in the mental health space. Hum a few bars about yourself, kind of your passion around this topic, and we'll move on.
Thank you very much, Greg. Yes, so my name is Paul Surgeoner. I've worked in mental health for about 20 years, particularly in suicide, self-harm prevention, in developing and delivering mental health awareness programs. I've also worked with organizations, including ABC, on how to develop mental health programs and looking at strategies and goals and how we can work these in. I think this is a particularly important issue for me because, like many issues in mental health, one of the big concerns is people not being aware of something being a problem or being a challenge until it's much too late. And then rather than planning for it and making sure that we are engaging properly, we're trying to clean up afterwards. So I think it's great to have this discussion beforehand. It's very important to be aware of a lot of these issues, and looking forward to being involved today, Greg.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate it. Again, full disclosure, Paul and I have worked together on some other work around suicide prevention, mental health, and that's rolled up to ACOSH as something that we've done. And this is, the lines are getting very blurred, I guess is what you're saying, Paul, between one and the other. And so saying all that, the man of the hour, quite frankly, is going to be the attorney sitting here, Mr. Scott Green. So Scott, I want to toss it to you, hum a few bars and tell us why this is an important topic for you to discuss today.
Sure thing, Greg. So my name's Scott Green. I'm a partner with the law firm Goldberg Segala. I practice management side labor and employment law. So I represent all sorts of employers in disputes of all kinds pertaining to the workplace, discrimination, drug testing, safety, wages, all sorts of things. And I guess my sort of gravitation towards the construction industry and this issue in particular is I grew up in that industry. My dad and uncles were all in it. I was working with them from an uncommonly young age, drafted, you might say. So it's always been familiar to me. It's been sort of like it feels like home always. And now here I am, an attorney. They turned out an attorney after all that. They failed to attract me to the world of construction. They probably should have gave me some better jobs. So I ended up here, and this is a hot topic for me. I'm a New York-based attorney, New York City metro area, although my firm's across the country. This is a big issue here in New York now with the passage of the recreational use law here in New York. So this is really pushed to the forefront. So I'm happy to be here today with all of you to speak about this.
Scott, I appreciate you being here. And it's funny how the magnet of our industry pulls you in, and you may say you're not in construction, but look what you're giving a presentation on and to whom you're giving it a presentation. So it kind of sucks us into the vortex. Last person I want to pull into this conversation is my wingman throughout the rest of this thing, Steve Wilshire. Steve, if you'll unmute yourself and just hum a few bars about your role at ABC and why this topic is important to you. Steve?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out to join us. At ABC, we decided several years ago that the physical safety of our employees is very, very important and continues to be, but we also recognize that something we call total human health is paramount to making sure that our folks get home, and then when they get home, stay safe at home as well. Mentally adjusted and so forth. So this is a big topic for us. It's a huge topic. I love having this team on here right now to talk about it. And I'm not going to waste a lot of our time, Greg. I'm just very excited to hear what they have to say. So thanks, guys, for being here.
I am too. I want to remind everyone we're using the chat feature to log questions. Steve knows the basic direction of the presentation. Having said that, if you do have a question, feel free to type it in. Steve's going to be monitoring that, and occasionally I'll ask him if he has any questions, but we're looking forward. So let's jump right into this thing. Paul, I'm coming to you. I'm going to go straight to you with a very specific question that says, you know, that people often call, particularly in this instance, marijuana, a gateway drug. And Scott mentioned in his opening that more and more states are actually adopting this or legalizing this for recreational use or whatever the case may be. But can you make the connection between marijuana use and opioid and suicide in just a few moments?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there has been some evidence that cannabis use can progress to other illicit substances, and that the THC in cannabis in particular might prime the brain, as it were, for enhanced responses to other drugs, including, as you mentioned, opioids, which does fit with the idea of marijuana being a gateway drug. But most people who use cannabis don't go on to use harder substances. I mean, it certainly can lead to cannabis use disorders and addiction, and we know that 1 in 6 people who start using it before the age of 18 will become addicted. But it's certainly not that if you take, you know, if you enjoy marijuana, you're going to become a hardcore opioid user. I think one of the other main theories is that a lot of people who are most vulnerable to drug taking are more likely to take what's available to them. And so the issue is the increasing widespread availability of cannabis as a first step. So does it have a role? I mean, it certainly is there, but I don't think for most people it does provide that gateway from marijuana use to much heavier, more illicit opioid use.
Yeah, again, I think just to kind of recite a little bit back to you, you know, while it is not necessarily the Pandora's box, if you will, it could lead, but it really becomes to what is acceptable in the area, particularly in the District of Columbia here where we are. It has a very recognizable footprint. And, you know, when you see a certain population in the nation's capital, Virginia recently did the same thing. So we're starting to see a widespread in an area that's been a little bit off the grid. Scott, I'm going to come to you with a question. With so many states, and again, the million-dollar question when it comes to the legal side of things, with so many states legalizing marijuana, some are saying construction companies should serve a carve out for marijuana, if you will, as far as their drug-free policies or workplace policies. What's your reaction to that statement?
Yeah, it's gonna be tough to do that, Greg, in terms of creating a carve out. So just legally, in terms of how it's shaking out amongst the states, the federal government's really not taken an official position on this at all. Marijuana is still illegal under federal law. There's a bill that just passed in the House, but apparently it's not likely to pass. So I don't think we're going to see anything there right away. And what the states are doing is some have done nothing. So you have no law in place. So the federal law kind of sits there and it's still enforceable. So no states, employers can still do, you know, what they've been doing all along. Then you've got medical use states where you're allowed to use it as a registered user for medical purposes. And then taking that a step further, some states sitting on top of that medical use statute, they're saying, okay, you're protected, you're in a protected class, and you're protected from, you know, certain job actions, termination, things of that nature because of that use. And then you have your recreational use states, which is, we're really seeing a surge now. And then there are states that protect those who use recreational in New York, including. So it's a carve out is difficult in safety sensitive positions, and I'm not aware of any state. Well, New York has something there, but it's not really helping the construction industry, and I'm not aware of any specific state that's really helping the construction industry by creating a carve out. Mm-hmm. At the same time, OSHA still has its general duty clause that says you have to maintain a safe workspace. So your obligation is there. They're just really leaving it up to the industry to police this thing, mm-hmm. which creates a headache for us.
Yeah, it could often be inconsistent in applications, and I think that becomes challenges. So, Chris, I'm coming your way. Same question. What is the owner community reeling about? How do they see this coming and influencing them? What is the direction they're wanting to kind of lean?
So, sort of piggybacking off of Scott's comments, you know, because marijuana is still considered a federally regulated drug on the Schedule 1. I'm not seeing a lot of owners that are embracing being able to carve out or even identify the differences between recreational use and or medical use. I was having this discussion with some lawyer friends of mine, and believe it or not, I actually do have a couple lawyer friends that I do like. So, we're having discussion around the use of marijuana, be it medical or recreational. And then I asked the question about, okay, you know, let's say there is a medical need for it. Am I, as an employer or an owner, am I responsible to, or am I still required to allow them to partake of their prescription while on the drug site? And they pretty much said it's a gray area in some respects, because states have laws in place that says yes, you have to do it, but at the same time, because the federal government says no, it is not a recognized approved drug, then no, I don't have to abide by that. So it's a gray area, and I might defer back to Scott on his comments on that statement. But you know, until there's a clear regulation from the federal government that legitimizes or legalizes marijuana, I just don't see a lot of companies making that move. If you go back to take a look, you know, we've always included alcohol as part of our substance abuse programs, testing for alcohol. You know, anybody over the age of 21 can buy alcohol in any state. And I think Louisiana, it's what, 18 or 19. But you don't need a prescription for it. But we also have recognized, scientifically proven thresholds that allow us to be able to say, yes, this person is impaired, no, they're not impaired. Mm-hmm. And until we either see that change in the federal regulation or an established threshold of impairment, I just don't see a lot of owners really embracing marijuana, whether it be medical or recreational.
Yeah. Interesting feedback, and thank you for that comment, because it's a gray area. You said it best, Scott. It's going to be subject to some interpretation, unfortunately, and I think you're going to have to get more people like Scott and attorneys that work in this space to help kind of keep your bulkhead available. One of the comments that came up in the chat box was, you know, we're allowed to act based on a safety sensitive position definition. And that may be one way that you can do it. You know, having said that, if my son or daughter is underneath the hook of a tower crane and, you know, a crane operator is rigging in the blind or lifting a load in the blind, I want to make sure they've got all their faculties and they just haven't partaken of their midday prescription, if you will. That could be problematic. And again, that's kind of worst case scenario, but it's something we got to think about somewhere down the line. So great feedback, gentlemen. I want to come now, Paul, back to you, just full circle. I want to really explore, we'd be remiss if we didn't have a conversation about the impact of COVID-19 on the workforce. Many are on the record stating that COVID could be a significant driver for the increase of marijuana and or other substance abuse. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? And if so, what is your position and why?
Yeah, I would agree with that completely, Greg. I mean, I don't think it's an understatement to say that for most people that the last 12 to 18 months, you know, it's been a very stressful experience. Aside from COVID itself, you've got increased isolation, you've got withdrawal of social networks and social supports, financial insecurity and job losses, and all the kind of personal and social challenges that these cause at so many levels. And I think that for many people, the way that they have dealt with the uncertainty and the stress and the frustration that comes with this has been increased substance use. So it's not a surprise that, like alcohol, cannabis sales did spike during the pandemic. And most states who have dispensaries even deemed that they were essential businesses. So it was even easier to get them in a lot of places. I mean, while I wouldn't begrudge someone a distraction during the chaos that we've all experienced, this reliance and this substance use isn't good for a few reasons. And the first one really is that it starts to establish this negative coping strategy. This is how you deal with something, by turning to these substances. It's a negative coping strategy because it doesn't actually resolve the problem. And more importantly, it doesn't help you cope with it better the next time you feel the same way. So it still doesn't give you those skills that you need. And so as a result, it stops you from exploring those more positive coping mechanisms, a way of managing these things, leads to dependency, addiction, a range of physical and mental health issues, and can, create personal tensions. And it's not a positive move. It doesn't help people. And I certainly do think it's something we need to be aware of.
Paul, you and I have worked a lot together on this topic, particularly when it comes to the construction workforce. Why do you think we as an industry are more susceptible maybe than other industries to this use or the illegal use of this substance?
Well, as we've discussed before, I mean, I think one of the most cited reasons is the image of the construction sector as being like a very stoical, masculine kind of thing, and place. There's a perception of toughness, of not showing pain, of always being in control. And these things don't exactly fit very well with the idea of accepting that things can be overwhelming, that you need to ask for help. And I think because of this as well, it also makes it difficult for mental health programs to really take a foothold in some of these sectors and industries too. Mm-hmm. I think some of the other factors are definitely that the transitory nature of the work. Quite often there's, especially over the last year and a half, concerns over job security. You've got your short-term contracts, and obviously the fact that so many workers in the construction area are men. And we all know how great men are at communicating. Obviously, us gentlemen aside, we're wonderful at it this afternoon. But I mean, without actually the support of mental health or well-being programs to think through these, to give you the support you need to help you to cope with these, it's not surprising that people self-medicate because they're trying to numb the symptoms because they can't get to the problem. So it's not an easy thing to do, but people do need to ask. And that's not easy to do in an industry that's obviously characterized as overtly masculine.
Scott, Chris, anything you'd like to unpackage around that topic about it being an industry that's pretty ripe or in a place where this could be abuse, could be an issue? Chris?
I tell you what, just looking over the past year and a half or whatever we've been in it seems like a lifetime at this point. But even talking to my friends, how are they coping? Having alcohol easily deliverable to the house now. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of my friends were drinking a lot more than what we normally do throughout the year. And there's definitely been some impacts on that situation. Mm-hmm. Sometimes having Amazon or free delivery isn't always a good thing. So, but even amongst the folks in the white collar side of the business, it was an issue.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. Anything?
Yeah, I think I might be speaking a little bit from experience here, but construction sites are predominantly male, and you put a bunch of men together, and it kind of feels like a little bit. You can feel a little bit like a gang, right? And I don't mean that in the bad sense. I mean that in kind of like a good sense, like a brotherhood. And I think when you kind of get together in that kind of setting, I think you can see some more of those types of behaviors that might lead to sort of casual drug or alcohol use. And I think it's just, the industry may change over time, but I think it still is that to a certain extent. So it can, a person could feel a little bit more free in that environment to do those sorts of things.
Yeah. It's interesting because you're all using words, brotherhood. Paul, you talked about it being essential throughout the pandemic. A lot of construction workers had to kind of wrap their head around that throughout the pandemic and the impact of COVID-19. Hey, I'm going to work every day. I may be potentially exposed, and then I'm going to take this home to my family. There's a lot of pressure that we didn't even necessarily think about in the workforce. And so, Scott, I'm going to come back to you with this next kind of statement here. The U.S. Surgeon General reported that collectively, roughly $85 billion is spent to treat injuries and infections and illnesses associated with risky or dependence upon a substance, some sort of use there. Recently, Quit Genius overall stated that there was a lost productivity as a result of substance disorders that cost employers $25.5 billion annually. And that workers with substance abuse disorders miss nearly 50% more days than their peers. And so I'm going to come to you first, but I want to talk about the front line. You said you represent a lot of people in this space. Chris, I'm also going to come to you, and I want to know about that owner, because that typically gets passed uphill some way or another. So your perspective. Scott, I'm going to stop and let you go first. Those are real dollars, by the way.
Sure, absolutely. And, that goes to the partly the why as an owner should I care about this, right? Why is this important? Obviously, no one wants an accident. No one wants to see anyone hurt. Construction can be dangerous, but beyond that catastrophic scenario, why should an employer invest? Why should they bother to train their managers? Why should they have a solid policy to govern this? Why should they stay up on the laws? If you can manage the problem more effectively, those are dollars that can be recaptured and put to good use, right? So it's about investing in your people. It's about getting more out of what you have and avoiding these lost dollars. And it goes to the question of it's going to require an investment, right? To pay attention and maybe have a few phone calls with a lawyer and to get things in order, to get these systems in place so that your managers are watching what's going on. You have the policy and the infrastructure to sort of deal with the problem and manage it effectively. There's potentially, at least, if you follow your logic, there's some real savings to be had there, and you can have a more productive workforce.
Scott, I'm also going to come back after I go to Chris, but what advice do you have to the listeners as we move to this next conversation about implementing what is a robust safety policy around this? And then I'll kind of come to you, Paul, as well. But Chris, let's talk about that: real dollars, real things in the owner's pocket, as well as the construction or the contractor's pocket as well. What's your position on that?
So a couple questions of what we mean by robust substance abuse program. Robust to an owner may not be the same as robust to a person who's a recreational marijuana user. But with that in mind, while preparing for this webinar, ran across some numbers that were from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And a study that they conducted found that there were 55% more industrial accidents and 85% more injuries amongst employees who tested positive for marijuana compared to those who tested negative. So, those are also part of those hidden costs when it comes to projects. And as you pointed out, Greg, someone eventually does pay for them, and usually it's the owner of the project that does. The dollar amounts that we're talking about are quite staggering. But from my perspective, one way that we could probably make our programs more robust, at least from an owner's perspective, is more impairment recognition training. We've always talked about be your brother or sister's keeper. Fit for duty. Years ago, fit for duty just meant, when I got into safety 28 years ago, hey, is the guy showing up drunk? Now is he showing up drunk? Is he showing up high? Is he mentally and emotionally there? And gals, I should say, are they there in full body? Are they mindful of where they're at, or is they're mindful with other things? So, I mean, our definitions over the year have changed of fit for duty. There's also another dollar amount that employers probably want to keep in mind when they're looking at their drug and alcohol screening programs, and that is their workers' compensation programs as well, because a lot of workers' comp carriers will give a 5% discount for having a zero tolerance policy on everything across the board. So, when an employer is trying to make up their mind, what does the definition of robust mean for them? Are they wanting to embrace the societal changes with the laws in the state where there's now recreational as well as medical marijuana? They need to start weighing that risk and reward. What's the value? What's the risk that I will entertain as the employer? if I do lessen my requirements. Let's say we do carve out that piece for marijuana without having a threshold of impairment. Those are the things that every company will need to look at and determine, okay, am I going to save more money by doing this, or am I going to lose my money on your loss of workers' comp discounts and things like that.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Scott, I said I was coming back to you, and I'm not asking you to give general legal advice here, but looking at it from your perspective, knowing there's always a day in court, what's your reactions when we say a robust substance abuse program? Are there 3 or 4 characteristics or an attribute that you think need to be paramount when people think about that?
Sure. So the first thing, we'll just give this sort of the standard lawyer's answer. You're gonna want to know what's going on in your state. That's number one. But it's so true here, because so many states are going in so many different directions. You're gonna want to really understand your state law. But and that's going to inform how you're gonna frame out your policy. So here's my first recommendation. You've got a substance abuse policy. The marijuana policy at this point for almost every state really must be a separate policy. And there's a few reasons for that. You're going to want to make sure that when you say illegal substances, that your employees actually know that you mean marijuana, because it might be legal where you are now. So that's number one. Have a separate policy that talks about cannabis, talks about marijuana, and what we mean by that, right? If the recreational use is legal in your jurisdiction, you're going to want to make sure that means, okay, that it's not permitted at work. You can't be actively using at work. This is always true. Okay, it's true of alcohol. It's true of marijuana. Now, there's some special problems associated with marijuana that make it a little more complicated, but present use is absolutely prohibited. You're going to want to make sure they understand that management, and there's been training amongst the staff. Okay, we all want to keep this workplace safe, and we've been trained to identify people who are presently impaired, and that's not going to be an easy task. But there's got to be an understanding, particularly on management and your foremen and the people there on the ground floor, that they understand what to look for in terms of impairment, and they're going to be looking for these things. And it's going to result, if you're viewed as being impaired on the job, you're going to be subject to, I wouldn't say right out of the box termination. Maybe eventually that's the case, but you're going to be at least pulled off the job site and subject to some form of discipline. And then there's just education on all sorts of clinical issues related to marijuana, the clinical the psychological and physical effects of it, because there's a not insubstantial group of people out there who don't necessarily equate it to alcohol in terms of impairment, which seems intuitive to most of us. But there are some people out there who simply don't believe that, and they need to be told that that this is going to be a problem to the extent they're operating a crane or operating heavy machinery, that this affects your performance in a negative way. You're creating a danger to your employees. This all needs to be wrapped up in a policy, and it needs to be provided to people. You got to put your employees on notice of this right out of the gate, right before they pick up a hammer or pick up their toolbox, that they know that the employer has rules about this, specific rules related to marijuana, and managers are trained to look out for it. And you're expected to identify any problems you see with any particular worker on the work site. And the final issue I'm going to say is, there's a lot of what ifs and things out there, but if you're management and you see someone who appears impaired on the job, okay, you could be wrong in your assessment. But if you see, if there's a checklist of 6 or 7 things you see going on with a person, and you check 5 boxes and you decide to pull that man or woman off the job site, right? You could be wrong, because there's no test right now. I know they're working on some things, but to my knowledge, there's no test like a breathalyzer to test for marijuana, right? So we're gonna just rely on our present sense observation. You could be wrong about that assessment, but that being wrong about it doesn't mean it's illegal and that you can be sued for it. Okay, so you're permitted to use your judgment in managing your workers on the site, and that's not necessarily going to lead to a lawsuit. Not doing anything, yeah, that's likely to lead to something to the extent there's an accident. But use your best judgment, observe your staff, make sure your staff is trained on how to see different issues with the staff, and you're permitted to take action based on what you see to keep your job site safe.
Thanks, Scott. A lot of information there. Paul, just kind of put a bow on this from your perspective. I mean, both Scott and Chris mentioned, equipping people to be able to make these observations. Well, let's be realistic, guys. You say that we have if you see something, say something culture, but in the grand scheme of things, how do you express the new role of the peer watching after peer for impairment? I mean, what does that look like, and what pitfalls would be there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things with this. The first one is that if someone is abusing drugs, alcohol, marijuana, whatever, there's a reason for that. It's very possible that they're trying to cope with something else, they're dealing with some other issues, which means they are bringing difficulties and their challenges onto the work site. In the same way that you make sure that you're aware of this from a physical health perspective, you also need to make sure that you're aware of this from a mental health perspective. And I think one of the most simple things that can be done is to make sure that you incorporate mental health into definitions of physical health. And I know, Greg, that's something that ABC have been making great strides in, because as we keep saying, there's no health without physical health. But I mean, I think that the ability to actually talk about mental health regularly, to remove the stigma, share experiences of people who've overcome challenges, especially, sounds strange, but has definitely worked, people in more senior roles talking about mental health challenges that they have overcome and continue to thrive, as well as doing all the things that Scott mentioned as well, training on mental health literacy, how do you identify signs and challenges of someone with mental health issues, to more concrete steps of what do we actually have in EAPs and our employee assistance programs. Is there an opportunity for short-term counselling, links perhaps to either drug or alcohol groups, connecting with local groups, local support groups, or mental health organizations. And then also, I mean, I know Scott mentioned the importance of policies to make sure these are in place, but the other side of that is that it should be very clear that it's okay for someone to discuss or disclose a mental health issue in a way that doesn't risk their job or their future career prospect. Right. Because no one is ever going to come and say, I've been having these problems. Oh, I'm very sorry to hear that, Greg. You've now lost your job. Yeah. So, there has to be a culture, there has to be an environment, there has to be the processes and steps in place there, because it is important to stress that people who have had mental health or addiction issues can and do recover. And not only do people do recover, but the people who stay clean and the people who can demonstrate abstinence don't only continue to live a drug-free life, but also have been shown to improve essential job skills, punctuality, and other key behaviors too. So yes, there may be an issue there, but by helping the staff overcome that, recovery is possible. And I think that's a really important message to hammer home too.
It really hits home, Paul. I mean, me personally, just again, full disclosure, I'm the chair of the Construction Industry Alliance for Suicide Prevention. Chris and I work together at ACOSH, and we've pushed this topic of mental health and suicide prevention all the way to the top of DOL and OSHA over there. What you said is what we need to really walk away from, aside from having the policies. What took the person to the place that they sought out and are now addicted to? And I think that's a different lens that we have to look through life at. And so it's very important. That was a great discussion. Paul, I want to stay with you for a moment. In the 1970s, according to High Times Magazine as a resource, just so you know, weed contained basically 1 to 3% of THC, okay, which is the active component of marijuana. Some studies say concentrates today are as high as 55%. And additionally, studies have found that marijuana use can cause severe consequences in the mental health space. So saying all that, marijuana is increasingly linked to the onset of psychosis and schizophrenia, and there's a lot of studies out there about this. Is this something we should really, really be concerned about in the construction industry, or is this a whole bunch of nothing about nothing?
No, I mean, I definitely think it is something that we need to be concerned about, especially as the potency increases. I mean, we know that there are a list of mental health and physical health issues, psychosis, especially when the THC content is more than 10%. And as you said, this can go, especially in the concentrates, this can go up as high as 85, 90% in some areas. So increasing the potency without knowing the consequences on our physical or mental health is concerning. But it's also concerning the fact that lots of people aren't aware that it has become more potent over time. And so this, it prevents or presents a lot more risks. And I think especially that the high potency approaches that perhaps are newer to people, like the concept of dabbing, which was a new one to me. This is heating really strong cannabis concentrate and inhaling the vapors, and in that the THC can be between 80 and 90%. This in particular has been demonstrated to have an impact on reckless behavior, number of emergency room visits, anxiety, paranoia, even nausea, abdominal pain, and can even alter brain structures. So yes, it's a huge issue. People aren't aware of it because I think there is this stereotype of, the 1970s, the 1980s stoner, lying back and relaxing, but at very high concentrations, what that does is it actually flips it. So it increases paranoia, anxiety, and increases reckless behavior as well.
Yeah. So again, it may, in the 70s and 80s, it could have been almost undetectable on a project. Now you've got significant behavior differences that can occur on that job site. Chris, I'm going to come to you on this one. This is, smart approach. And let's talk about workforce, because you said you've been in this business for 28 years and some of that was on job sites and in facilities. Smart approaches to marijuana had a lessons learned from the state of marijuana legalization report. They recently stated that over 25% of cannabis use disorder was among 12 to 17-year-olds in those legal states. And those are our future construction professionals and your future engineers and all the people that are going to work in both sides of the hall there. If employers prohibit marijuana in light of these statistics, how are we going to find adequate staffing?
That is a darn good question. And I wish I had the silver bullet, because if I did, I'd be selling that idea and going around the country. But, from a, how are we going to staff our jobs? I know a lot of companies outside of construction are just doing away with drug testing altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help the situation? Yeah, it helps you get employees, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily, you may not be getting the quality employee that you're looking for either.
Mm-hmm.
As I was stating earlier, with the increased use of recreational marijuana, 87% of the people that were injured were impaired, or whatever the statistic was. I saw a statistic the other day, and I'm drawing this off the top of my head. Colorado, since they've legalized recreational marijuana there, I believe auto accidents are up 50%. So, I mean, we're talking some serious numbers there. I guess what we really need to be looking at is the abuse of marijuana, whether it be recreational or medicinal. But again, if we could determine what's considered a impaired threshold with marijuana, that would take a lot of this question, a lot of the flow out of the discussion. Once we could say, hey, if we had the right testing, as Scott pointed out, we don't have a lot of great testing out there. Mm-hmm. I'll be honest with you, I'm more concerned about the synthetic drugs that we don't test for, that are out there. So, we could probably go to a 20-panel drug screen and still not capture a lot of the new stuff that's coming out. But from an abuse standpoint, I think we, as just any decent human being, should just reach out to the person and try to find out what those underlying factors are. As Paul indicated, there's a lot of, there could be some mental health issues there that we're unaware of. And, just like when I'm trying to do a root cause analysis, I hear what people are telling me, but I like to know what was the mindset of the person at the time of the incident. If it was an infraction, why did they make that infraction? So, you know, trying to understand what's going on behind the scenes will go a long way with that. From an employer perspective, you know, encourage use of employee assistance programs. You know, just because a person is using recreational marijuana, it doesn't make them a bad person. You know, let's encourage the use of those EAPs, counselors, and other services that you might be providing as an employer, and make them easily accessible and reasonably priced.
Right. You know, we say EAP, but often that's the least used benefit of any HR package out there, because people feel like you're going to leave a digital fingerprint somewhere.
Exactly.
We've got about maybe 7 minutes left here. Scott, I'm going to come to you in a pretty, Scott, I'm coming to you in a pretty fast fashion. You mentioned a moment ago, and I think this is important for us to talk about, what is our obligation, you know, when it comes to addressing abuse, or in the instance somebody put in the chat box, use on a job site. I mean, you know, you mentioned just a moment ago that we accept a legal obligation at some point in time should an incident happen, but what are we obligated to make sure we have when we say we have a drug and alcohol-free workplace?
So what we're talking about is use on the job there.
That's correct.
So we're not, yeah, use on the job is it's still that's a no-fly zone. You know, that you can't use on the job. True of alcohol, true of marijuana or any drug. So that's an employer's obligation. It's a real obligation, absolute obligation, to make sure there's nobody using on the job. That's bright line. Where it gets tricky with marijuana particularly is that, and where it really undermines drug testing is, someone tests positive, you can't really tell, because the way it measures metabolites, you can't really tell whether they used 5 days ago on a Saturday or on a Thursday. You know, that's the problem. But employer obligation, absolutely root out on the job use.
Scott, thanks. Chris, I'm coming back to you very, very quickly, okay? How have you, as an owner, construction user, how have you, or what behaviors or things have you put in place, empowered an organization that may be working inside your facility or doing some work to address this? I mean, is there anything that your organization has done to make them feel more confident about being in this space?
At this point, we've really not addressed that issue. We've not really had a lot of requests for accommodations around the use of medical marijuana. And of course, I don't think anybody would actually come up to us and say, hey, can you, we allow us to recreationally use on the job site. But you know, if we were to accommodate a worker that has come forward and says, hey, I do have a prescription for medical marijuana, I tell you what, we would want to make sure that every effort was made to not only protect the worker that was, you know, has the prescription, but for the entire workforce, so nobody's safety is compromised. Right. You know, you never know when you just might, for lack of a better word, you know, overdose on your prescription that day. Pour a little more into the whatever method it is you're taking, and you know, you have slowed reflexes and slow cognitive impairment. We want to make sure that those things will be addressed. But you know, from a perspective as an owner, I just really don't see us getting to that point until again we can find those thresholds, impairment thresholds, that we would really start encouraging this. And Scott, I'm going to defer. Actually, I'm going to ask you a question if you don't mind, Greg.
Yeah,
because
3 minutes. Go for it.
Okay, but this is serious though. You have states where the state says medical marijuana is able to be used. Federal government says no, we don't recognize any marijuana usage at all. I know companies that are receiving federal grants or using federal money for projects, they've got a zero tolerance on that. But as an employer, is there an obligation in a state that allows medical marijuana use? Is there an obligation for them to acknowledge that for that particular employee without having federal repercussion?
And to permit on-the-job use because of lawful? No. And some states come right out and say that it'll be built right into the law. I wish I could think of one off the top of my head, but I'm not going to flip through my chart. But yeah, some of them will specifically say, you know, that doesn't confer the right to use on the job site. when it's silent, it still doesn't put an employer in the position of having to tolerate or accommodate somebody to use while at work. That's not an obligation that employers have to be concerned about in this whole realm of concerns.
So didn't mean to steal your thunder there, Greg. Sorry.
Listen, my thunder clapped a long time ago, Chief. You know that. So, all right. So here's a closing question. Everybody's got 30 seconds to respond. Okay. What will drug-free workplace policies look like going forward? Paul, I'm coming to you. What are the things that you think are going to wildly change in our industry with regards to drug-free workplace policies going forward?
Well, from my perspective, unsurprisingly, I'm more concerned about creating a workplace environment where people can identify and discuss and get help for a mental health or substance use issue without that fear of stigma or persecution or the risk of damaging their prospects. So something that is aware of these issues and takes this into consideration from a mental health perspective, that's what I would like to see in some kind of workplace policy going forward.
Scott, coming to you, same question. What will a drug-free workplace look like going forward with all this going on around us?
It would include distinctions between marijuana and other types of drugs that are actually illegal. So we have to distinguish between illegal and legal drug use. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the key first step, and then you go from there.
It was interesting what you said a moment ago, Chris, about the synthetics. That's often the stuff that we don't pay attention to. And it is something that's very, very important. But from your perspective, what are your thoughts on the drug-free policies going forward in America?
To be honest with you, I think I'm not as optimistic until we can get those thresholds established. And especially with the increase in the number of synthetics that are out there, I still think that we've got a long ways to go before we have a very comprehensive drug-free programs in the U.S.
Okay. A couple of questions I want to throw out there right quick, just as kind of a raise your hand if you've got an opinion about it. We've got literally a minute and a half before I give this back to Rana. There was one question or one statement: shouldn't we engage in a more interactive process to make it clear that the construction position is not protected by ADA, i.e. disability and or prescription, and the medical marijuana laws? So is there any delineation there from your perspective as an attorney, Scott?
Yeah, so that's a big question from Jill, and I read it in the chat as we were going through the presentation. So there's always an obligation for someone who has a disability and a record of drug use is considered a disability to engage in what they call the interactive process to see if you can accommodate that employee to figure out if there's an arrangement to allow them to perform their essential functions of their job, right? Just clearly, and this sounds like I'm stating the obvious, allowing them to be impaired while working would not be a type of accommodation that would be permitted. Are there other sorts of things, modification of job duties, things like that? Maybe. And that interactive process or that discussion between the employer and employee is always something that needs to happen. But the big distinction there is that there's a difference between a record of drug use, so past use, right, versus present use. Present use is never protected under the ADA, present impairment. So that's a big distinction to make. But Jill's question is a really good one. That interactive process concept is out there, particularly if you have a record of drug use in the past.
Thank you so much. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating in this webinar today. I hope you found a nugget of information that made your life just a little bit better, or at least gave you a direction or a compass point that you can start moving in. Scott Green, Paul Surgeon, and Chris, gosh, thank you guys for being a part of this. As a great man once told me, the best sign of a good project manager on a job site is to come in ahead of schedule. I'm right now giving it back to you, Rana, with 3 minutes on the clock, at least from my perspective, and you can make your closing comments and we'll be right at an hour. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Greg and Scott and Paul and Chris and Steve. We really appreciate your time that you've taken today and the preparation that you have made for today. Would like to remind everyone to keep checking for CURT events. They are out on curtevents.com for you. And we look forward to seeing you once again in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.